For decades, Quentin Tarantino built a reputation as Hollywood's boldest visionary, the director who resurrected careers, rewrote cinematic rules, and turned actors into legends. His films celebrated loyalty, artistry, and creative freedom. Yet at 62, Tarantino quietly disrupted that image by revealing a list of actors he refuses to work with again. Names once associated with admiration suddenly became symbols of disappointment. Behind the glamour and acclaim, a deeper story of fractured trust, creative clashes, and personal reckoning began to surface. Quentin Tarantino's rise was not powered by conventional ambition. It was driven by a fierce, almost sacred devotion to creative loyalty. From the beginning, he believed that cinema was built on trust between storyteller and performer, between vision and execution, between risk and reward. In an industry shaped by contracts, politics, and quiet betrayals, Tarantino carved out a reputation as an anomaly. A director who stood by his actors. A filmmaker who resurrected forgotten careers and transformed overlooked talent into cultural icons. On his sets, performers were not disposable tools. They were collaborators, guardians of a shared dream. Tarantino's scripts were demanding, layered, and emotionally punishing, yet actors returned again and again, drawn by the promise of creative freedom. His films became sanctuaries for those who had been cast aside, offering not only employment, but dignity. Careers revived. Legacies reborn. Loyalty, in his world, was currency. This unwavering commitment elevated Tarantino beyond standard Hollywood power structures. He refused to play by studio formulas. He resisted casting trends. Instead, he followed instinct, memory, and emotional resonance. His choices often appeared reckless, but time and again, they proved visionary. The industry watched as once-forgotten performers delivered career-defining performances, bound together by a director who demanded nothing less than total immersion. Yet beneath this carefully maintained mythology lay a quieter truth. Loyalty, when demanded absolutely, becomes fragile. As Tarantino's fame intensified, the weight of expectation began to distort his creative sanctuary. Success brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought pressure. And pressure exposed fractures. Actors arrived with stronger agents, louder demands, and increasingly fortified egos. Studios pressed for broader appeal. Marketing teams demanded compromises. Slowly, the sacred space of collaboration became contested territory. Behind closed doors, artistic disagreements deepened. Lines that once symbolized creative freedom became battlegrounds for control. Performance choices evolved into power struggles. Scheduling conflicts turned into tests of allegiance. Tarantino, who once celebrated individuality, now found himself enforcing boundaries to protect his vision. Every compromise felt like erosion. Every challenge felt personal. The reality, however, was far different from the public image. What audiences perceived as effortless brilliance was, in truth, forged through relentless emotional discipline. Tarantino demanded total surrender to the story. Absolute presence. Unquestioned dedication. For those who matched his intensity, the collaboration became transformative. For those who did not, the relationship deteriorated quickly. In his mind, artistic hesitation equaled emotional betrayal. Years later, these unresolved tensions accumulated silently. Each fractured collaboration left residue. Each disappointment chipped away at the foundation of his idealism. What began as admiration slowly mutated into guarded skepticism. Casting decisions became more selective. Collaborations narrowed. The director, who once embraced chaos, began tightening control, not out of dominance, but out of preservation. This evolution marked the quiet erosion of a deeply held belief that loyalty could survive unchallenged in a system built on ambition. By the time Tarantino entered his sixth decade, the emotional cost of maintaining that belief became undeniable. Public interviews, once playful and celebratory, grew reflective. Statements became measured. And then, without spectacle, came the admission. Certain actors, once embraced, would never work with him again. No sensational accusations. No public feuds. Just a carefully restrained acknowledgement that lines had been crossed. The revelation unsettled the mythology surrounding him. For decades, Tarantino had embodied creative fidelity. Now he openly acknowledged its limits. Not in anger, but in resignation. The shift revealed a man confronting the emotional toll of his ideals, a reckoning with the reality that even the most passionate loyalty cannot survive repeated fracture. This moment was not a collapse. It was a recalibration, an acceptance that creative purity, when pushed against the machinery of fame, inevitably breaks. His words carried neither bitterness nor triumph, only the quiet gravity of hard-earned clarity. Because behind the cinematic bravado lived a deeply emotional truth. Loyalty had shaped him, but it had also wounded him. The admission signaled a turning point, not just in his public narrative but in his personal philosophy. The director, who once believed in unconditional creative bonds, now recognized the cost of such devotion. And with that realization, the story shifted from celebration to introspection, from triumph to psychological excavation. But the real rupture did not begin with fame. It began long before the world ever knew his name. Long before Quentin Tarantino commanded film sets or reshaped cinematic history, his relationship with storytelling was already forming, intensely, obsessively, and irrevocably. Raised in an environment where cinema became refuge, identity, and emotional survival, he absorbed films not merely as entertainment, but as lifelines. Each scene, each character, each line of dialogue became a fragment of self-understanding. Movies were not an escape from reality. They were the language through which reality made sense. From an early age, Tarantino developed an almost reverential bond with cinema. He studied film with the devotion of a scholar and the hunger of someone searching for belonging. This emotional fusion shaped not only his creative voice, but his expectations of those who would one day join him. For Tarantino, filmmaking was sacred labor. To approach it casually was not indifference, it was betrayal. As his career unfolded, this psychological framework became embedded into every collaboration. Actors were no longer performers delivering lines. They became vessels for emotional truth. Each role demanded immersion, vulnerability, and absolute commitment. Tarantino's scripts were complex, layered, and rhythmically precise. He expected performers to surrender to the story, to abandon self-consciousness, and to trust his vision completely. This was not control. It was communion. But communion requires reciprocity. And in Hollywood, reciprocity is fragile. As Tarantino's fame expanded, the emotional intimacy of collaboration collided with an industry increasingly governed by ego, branding, and contractual negotiation. Actors arrived with public images to protect. Agents arrived with conditions. Studios arrived with pressure. What once existed as a shared artistic pilgrimage slowly transformed into a battlefield of expectations. Behind closed doors, these tensions intensified. Performers questioned dialogue, requested alterations, negotiated tone. Some pushed for creative input. Others prioritized personal image over narrative authenticity. To many directors, this was routine compromise. To Tarantino, it felt like erosion. Every adjustment threatened the emotional architecture he had constructed so meticulously. The conflict was not about authority. It was about meaning. For Tarantino, cinema demanded absolute emotional surrender. Anything less suggested fear, vanity, or detachment. When actors hesitated, the fracture cut deep. Not because of ego, but because of emotional vulnerability. His films were extensions of his identity. To challenge them was to challenge him. Over time, this psychological rigidity became both his greatest strength and his deepest vulnerability. The same standards that produced unforgettable performances also cultivated isolation. Collaboration became selective. Trust narrowed. Emotional boundaries hardened. Years passed. Films accumulated. Accolades multiplied. But beneath the success, unresolved disappointments quietly accumulated. Each strained collaboration left residue. Each fractured partnership carved another line into his emotional armor. The loyalty he once extended freely became conditional, not out of bitterness, but out of emotional survival. Gradually, Tarantino began to draw invisible lines. Those who aligned with his creative discipline crossed into long-term collaboration. Those who resisted quietly disappeared from his cinematic orbit. He did not wage public battles. He did not issue condemnations. Instead, he withdrew. Silence became separation. Absence became judgment. This pattern was not vindictive. It was protective. Behind the bravado and cinematic swagger existed a deeply sensitive psychological core. Tarantino internalized conflict. He processed disappointment privately. Rather than explode, he absorbed. Rather than retaliate, he recalibrated. And in that quiet recalibration, relationships ended without spectacle. But emotional restraint carries a cost. As years progressed, the cumulative weight of suppressed frustration demanded release. The public revelation of least favored collaborators was not spontaneous honesty. It was the result of decades of internal conflict finally reaching resolution. By the time Tarantino spoke openly, the emotional verdict had already been sealed. The statements were calm, measured, devoid of anger. That restraint revealed the depth of prior struggle. These were not grudges. They were conclusions. Each name symbolized not resentment, but closure. For Tarantino, acknowledging disappointment publicly was not about exposing others. It was about reconciling himself with the emotional toll of creative devotion. The confession represented acceptance, acceptance that loyalty, when demanded absolutely, inevitably collides with human limitation. And in that acceptance, something shifted. The director, who once sought emotional perfection in collaboration, began recognizing its impossibility. Human complexity replaced idealism. Understanding replaced expectation. His standards remained uncompromising, but his emotional framing evolved. Cinema remained sacred, but its practitioners were no longer required to be flawless. Yet that realization did not arrive gently. It arrived through conflict, through erosion, through silent disappointment, and ultimately through reckoning. Because when deeply held ideals meet repeated fracture, silence eventually becomes impossible. And when that silence finally breaks, the consequences reverberate far beyond individual relationships. And when those silent boundaries were finally crossed, the fallout became impossible to hide. Quentin Tarantino had spent decades cultivating trust, fostering loyalty, and elevating actors into cinematic immortality. For him, collaboration was not transactional, it was transformative. Each actor he chose was a vessel for his vision, each performance a test of devotion to the story. He believed that with the right commitment, magic could happen, performances that transcended the script, the camera, and even the audience's expectations. For years, this belief shaped the mythology surrounding him, a director who could turn anyone into a legend. But the mythology was fragile. Beneath the polished exterior of film premieres and award ceremonies lay a quiet erosion of admiration. Actors he once revered began to disappoint, not with malice, but through choices that collided with his uncompromising standards. Some challenged his authority on set, questioning decisions he regarded as inviolable. Others prioritized personal branding over narrative fidelity, negotiating scenes to highlight themselves rather than the story. Every deviation, small or large, felt to Tarantino like a breach of trust, an emotional betrayal that cut deeper than mere professional disagreement. This was the breaking point, the intersection of admiration and disillusionment. A director who had once embraced chaos and eccentricity now saw fractures where he once saw brilliance. He became increasingly selective, quietly cataloging loyalty and compromise. Names began to disappear from his casting considerations, not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of deliberate omission. Each choice carried weight. Each rejection was an unspoken judgment. The emotional stakes of these decisions were immense. Tarantino did not act from impulse or spite. He acted from the cumulative burden of disappointment, from the subtle, invisible erosion of years spent demanding devotion that was not always reciprocated. For him, it was never just about cinema, it was about the moral and psychological integrity of collaboration. Every misalignment, every hesitation, every self-serving decision by an actor challenged the sacred covenant he believed existed between director and performer. By the time he chose to speak publicly, the pattern had been decades in the making. The revelation of his least favored collaborators was not rash. It was measured, deliberate, almost surgical. The names themselves were symbolic, markers of fractured alliances, failed expectations, and the painful acknowledgement that loyalty, no matter how fiercely extended, had its limits. The tone of his disclosure was calm, restrained, and devoid of anger. Yet it carried immense emotional gravity. The public, accustomed to Tarantino's bravado and cinematic audacity, was taken aback. The image of a director who had once seemed indefatigable, forgiving, and universally loyal was replaced by a man grappling with human imperfection, in others and within himself. The revelation forced a reckoning not just with individual actors, but with the industry that constantly demanded compromise, ego management, and diplomacy over emotional honesty. In these confessions lay a paradox. The same director who had made loyalty his hallmark now wielded rejection as a tool of clarity. Admiration had transformed into guarded discernment. Trust had hardened into boundaries. And in this transformation, Tarantino revealed something profoundly human, that even the most passionate belief in loyalty must eventually confront reality. The fallout of this reckoning rippled quietly through Hollywood. Longtime collaborators wondered if they had misstepped. Rising stars realized that devotion alone might not be enough. And Tarantino himself, for the first time publicly, admitted that artistic integrity comes at the price of fractured relationships. Yet this reckoning did not end in bitterness. It opened the door to something far more unexpected. The frenetic energy of youth and rebellion gave way to reflection. The director who had once thrived on confrontation and creative chaos now turned his gaze inward, contemplating the emotional costs of his uncompromising vision. Every masterpiece, every career-defining performance, every celebrated scene carried a hidden ledger of strain, disappointment, and quiet regret. The world saw cinematic brilliance. He felt the weight of fractured trust, of moments when loyalty had faltered, of opportunities lost to human complexity. Tarantino's approach evolved. Where he had once demanded absolute immersion and near-sacred obedience, he now sought alignment, not through coercion, but through careful selection. The actors he chose to collaborate with in these years were not simply talented. They were attuned to his rhythm, willing to inhabit the delicate balance between personal expression and collective narrative. In this selective environment, the creative sanctuary he had long defended could finally breathe again. He began to see his legacy not as a catalog of triumphs alone, but as a testament to emotional resilience. The films were still audacious, sharp, and unmistakably his, but the process had become tempered by wisdom. Tarantino had learned that emotional stakes, when mismanaged, could derail even the most inspired artistry. And so he refined his standards, allowing intuition and experience to guide him rather than unyielding expectation. This stage of his career was marked by quiet reconciliation. Old disappointments remained, but they no longer dictated every choice. The director's statements about least favored actors, once shocking, were now understood as part of a broader narrative, one of psychological honesty and the inevitable reckoning that comes with decades in a mercurial industry. He acknowledged past fractures without rancor, recognizing that disappointment is often a mirror reflecting not only the failures of others, but the limitations of one's own expectations. In this period, Tarantino's emotional focus shifted toward preservation and closure. The same uncompromising loyalty that had once isolated him now became a tool for maintaining creative and personal equilibrium. He distilled decades of experience into guiding principles, learning to protect both his vision and his inner peace. This was not retreat, it was evolution. The director, who had once challenged every deviation, now sought harmony in the collaborations that remained, understanding that artistic brilliance and human fragility must coexist. The final lesson of this phase is both subtle and profound. Genius is not only measured in cinematic achievement, but in emotional endurance. Tarantino's journey illustrates that the most enduring legacies are crafted not just through audacity, but through the quiet reconciliation of ideals with human imperfection. In embracing this truth, he transformed the narrative from scandal or confrontation to one of introspection and growth. The stories of broken trust, of fractured collaborations, became testimonies of hard-earned wisdom, reminders that even a legend must navigate the fragile terrain of human relationships. Because the greatest reckoning is not with others, but with oneself.